This is Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. In each episode, we bring you information, insights, and ideas from some of the industry's top thought leaders. Connect with us to help pick the topic and guide the show.
This is Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. I'm your host, Jamie Wood. Hey, I'm back after a little break. I got to say, 4 years of the podcast. I decided to take a couple of months off. Also, my lovely producer, Joe, went to have a baby. So use that opportunity to take a break and have actually been traveling around the country with Nova Entertainment here in Australia, which is a new client running their Amplify program. So life has been busy, but I am excited to get back in. I have got a great topic to unpack, which is around brief to pitch. So brief to pitch, probably, one of the most important elements of a high-performing media sales team is having what I refer to as a hygienic sales process, meaning it is clean, it is clear, it's healthy, it's robust, etc., etc. Whilst most sales processes encompass everything from initial prospecting right through to the post-campaign analysis, the brief to pitch stage is its own unique subset of a great sales process. And it's been my observation that most high-performing media sales teams, particularly agency sales teams, are constantly focusing on this. They're refining it, they're improving it, they're really making sure their brief to pitch workflow is dialed in. Our guest today, she's a friend, she's a former colleague of mine, one of my favorite people to have collaborated with in my career. It's Lena Rapley. So I'm super excited to get into this one and unpack the world of brief to pitch.
The first five.
Lena, welcome.
Good morning.
Tell us a bit about your background in media and your current role. We obviously worked together for some time, but what have you been up to in the last couple of years?
Look, I've been in the media industry for over 15 years now, and I guess I've ended up in a spot where I'm just really passionate about high impact content and working with brands to get the best results. And I guess how that's come to life is I've ended up being in positions across kind of various commercial departments in sales, integration, leading strategy teams, working really closely with content across audio, digital, and now I'm giving a hand at Total TV.
This is actually really interesting. When I was designing this topic of brief to pitch, you and I obviously worked together in radio, and I remember you worked in various roles from sales leadership to setting up different sort of integration units and whatnot. I wanted to talk to you about this whole concept of brief to pitch as its own specific subset of a sales process. And I'd love to hear from you across your various roles. Why is it so important, maybe particularly in the current market, to have a well-defined brief to pitch process?
At the end of the day, as a salesperson, you've really got to have a balance between delivering the best results and solutions for your clients, whilst also considering your product and what you need to get out for the business. So a really strong process allows for that in terms of allowing those results, but it also enables really great clarity on accountability, expectations, how we can manage what goes in and then what comes out at the other end of it. I think the other thing that's really interesting is I was reading some research the other day just around, I guess, general culture and how you can drive a really progressive and constructive culture in a workplace. And there's a lot of evidence out there as well that speaks to just how much people really lean into and love clarity of roles and responsibilities. And that's where the brief to pitch process, I guess, really shines, because it enables both salespeople and commercial enhancement teams to just know where they need to play, how they work together to get the best result, both for obviously the business and then the client at the end of the day.
So funny because, I always remember thinking that a lot of interpersonal or interdepartmental conflict that occurs, particularly in media companies, many times it's actually a symptom of process conflict or just a misalignment in something in a process. It feels like it sort of manifests as being quite adversarial or, people not potentially getting along or acting particularly professional. But it always feels like when you really go back and diagnose the root cause of some of that frustration, some of that tension, it's often just a misalignment around understanding of who is responsible or accountable for what in the process. Is that your observation too?
Yeah, it's a good insight. And look, I think that also leads to, and I've laughed over the years in media and marketing, and certainly from a media side of things, we work in comms businesses, right? And then you find yourself in these situations which you've been impacted or limited with process, but it really just comes down to, I guess, a lack of communication and really understanding who's owning that communication or that moment and how you can best work together to get that outcome and result.
I love that. Well, looking forward to getting into this today.
Media Sales Mastery.
Every business is kind of different. And I think like at a macro level, I'm just keen to hear from you, like what are the key steps or stages in a media brief to pitch process?
One big step is really having clarity on what the expectations are or what the win looks like for a brief and a client and a brand. If you have an understanding of what that looks like, then you can truly match what your product solution looks like and how you're able to, I guess, deliver a really creative or strategic idea that's going to drive results. So that's certainly the first step, is understanding what's going to work best for that brief and what the client or the agency are really looking for. The next stage is working internally on what that solution looks like. As a salesperson, it's about setting that right tone and energy and working with the different departments and stakeholders to take them on the journey to help build out what that final response looks like. The other element is really going from a pitch perspective. What areas do you need or what do you need to pull together to really wow the sale? How do you bring your client on a journey when it comes to taking them through what that solution or response looks like? Do you need to pull in graphic designers? Do you need to build in their own templates? Do you present in person or do you present digitally online? And then that final piece is that sales piece that I know that a lot of salespeople in market, we say that we're salespeople, but sometimes we forget you got to have the sale and the close and really bring to life some of those techniques that you've been working on in terms of asking for the close, asking, what parts of the solution they liked, where we could enhance, how we can do better, and then whether or not we need to, finesse or really sharpen that final solution to win against a competitive market.
Amazing top-line summary there, Lena. I'd love to dive into this a little bit more specifically in some of these steps. So let me sort of throw a scenario at you. A massive brief hits your inbox. Let's say it's a pretty substantial, significant spend or share. It's something that just at first review requires a high-level strategic rationale. Maybe there's a level of content or talent integration required. It might be some sort of bespoke concept. All wrapped up in a nice price value equation. Maybe even some very aggressive pricing or something that might be beyond the sort of parameters of what you would typically be able to unlock. So you've got one of those kind of briefs that hits your inbox, let's say a quarter defining brief. What's your first step upon receiving that brief? What do you typically sort of recommend people would do in that scenario as it's hit their inbox?
Look, so I think that there's many things that you can do, which you would say would be the first step in the process. I think naturally it's best to read through that email and fully understand what the brief looks like and really identify whether or not there's gaps in that brief that you need to understand that are going to help you work what that solution looks like through the business. If there are gaps in that brief, I'd say you pick up the phone and you reach out to your client and you ask some questions and listen. It's really, I think, important from a sales perspective to be able to interrogate that brief and really be able to understand what that win looks like. The second piece to, I guess, setting yourself up for success is really as that salesperson, you're the lead on that piece of business. You want to set the right tone and energy within the team so that you're really able to get all the key stakeholders on board and get them on that journey in terms of working up what that solution looks like, having passion within the business so that you can just set yourself up to really know what that final response looks like.
I love the way you've been able to distill that down because it can feel like a really messy, confusing situation. I see a lot of overwhelm that happens when that type of brief actually hits a salesperson's inbox, and they'll typically start catastrophizing or panicking or almost be paralyzed as to what that next step is. The thing that I thought was really interesting, Lena, and I know this is probably something that's not really a technique we talk enough about, but it was what you said around socializing or kind of PRing the brief with stakeholders. So, before it goes through the proper internal briefing process, actually kind of making key stakeholders just aware of it and just giving a little bit of the high level context of this has arrived, this is a material piece of business, this is an amazing opportunity, stand by, this is coming through. It almost to me feels like a way to sort of soften the blow when potentially the next few requirements start coming through, or the requests start coming through that department. Is that a fair assessment?
100%. And look, I think it comes back to, again, how you work with others in a workplace environment. We speak a lot around creative thinking. Over the years, you end up doing quite a bit of creative brainstorming when it comes to media and marketing. And there's certainly moments where you start to see and learn that people think differently. Some people are really great and able to and capable to be able to think on the fly, be really dynamic and problem solve, whereas others like time to digest. They might need 24, 48 hours to really come up with that solution or bring ideas to the table. And I feel like that kind of summarizes just human nature by itself. If you're able to, as you say, speak up front, give people the heads up that there's something coming through that's really exciting, and then also put it in process, you're kind of ticking two different boxes in terms of how people think and how people like to process potential workflow or workload coming through their inbox.
So let's say we've got a small window of opportunity to interrogate the brief with the client or agency. It might be something to the effect in the brief of, due to the volume of briefs, we're going to set aside 15, 20 minutes, to provide any sort of clarification or to answer any additional questions you might have. At what stage do you recommend the brief interrogation with the client or agency occurs? And what are some of those things that you're going to be prioritizing in terms of the absolute critical need to know information?
In a perfect world, I think there's 3 moments that you can interrogate the brief or what the win or solution looks like. As soon as it hits your inbox and you've had a good read through, if there's any gaps there, or even if there's not, it's a really great way to be able to drive that relationship and have a connection with the client, learn more about their business and understand where the opportunity lies for you to help support them deliver results. The second moment would be midway through. Typically in a brief to pitch process in media, we'll go through those, that formal process internally, and we'll get to a point where we have some initial ideas as to what the solution could look like. At this point, it's actually a really great moment to top-line what those ideas could look like, top-line the direction as to where they could go, and perhaps speak a bit about how that strategy supports their overall planning process to get a bit of feedback to really be able to, finesse what that result looks like. The final moment is in the room when you're pitching. Always ask for feedback in the room. Always ask open-ended questions around what the campaign looked like, how they felt, and how that fits within their broader kind of plan. Now, if you were to ask me if you could only have one of those moments to clarify, I would take a guess at probably that midpoint. It's a really great opportunity to go, here's 2 or 3 ways that we could bring this to life. If you could provide feedback at this point in time on how the solution could work, then you're able to finesse, but you're also in a position to be able to add wow factor to your pitch and really surprise them on the day to close on what that solution looks like for them.
It's so funny hearing you talk about uncovery, because I think we think uncovery is this very one-dimensional, asking for questions that weren't covered in the brief, seeking clarification, just firing off a bunch of additional requests for information. And it sounds to me like really a good uncovery actually is quite strategic in terms of setting you up for maybe a competitive advantage in the pitch where you're socializing, top-lining different ideas, different ways of thinking, you're differentiating, you're kind of keeping the client or the agency engaged in how the idea is taking shape, so they might feel they've got some level of investment or almost like co-creating the idea with you before you pitch. So interesting, Lena, because I do worry that we still have this old thinking of let's go and wow them in the room with a big idea and let's not show our cards too early. And it seems to me like your approach is really about minimizing your downside and actually making sure that your uncovery isn't just about asking questions to have a great pitch. It's actually about almost keeping it as a fluid, co-creative kind of process so that the pitch is really almost a foregone conclusion as to what you're presenting in the room.
Yeah, you've nailed it. I mean, that's really about bringing the client and the team that you're working with on the journey, right? I feel like over the last 10, 15 years, we see these periods of time when it comes to overarchingly what we would call sales techniques and selling techniques. We're certainly in the age within media and more in those, those traditional media houses we're really in a partnership sales cycle. So we want to work really closely with brands to be able to minimize, I guess, the risk of a big idea being completely off the mark and ensuring that we're really close to nailing what that solution looks like for our clients.
This is probably a bit more of an advanced kind of line of thinking here, but one of the things that I think is really interesting to unpack, I know you were brilliant at this, Lena, when we worked together, is preempting potentially what the competitors are going to also respond with, and even finding if there's a way to kind of nullify that in your uncovery. So what I mean by that is, let's say the brief reads to you like a competitor is going to come back with a very particular type of solution, be it engagement with this particular talent, using this particular type of environment, and an idea that might look, taste, and feel kind of like this. You know, you build up a little bit of a repertoire of understanding how your competitors respond to different briefs. But being able to then go into that uncovery and almost kind of say, hey, listen, here's what we think would be the way that this might be responded to. Here's why we actually recommend that this idea that we want to put forward is superior or different. Is that something that you find is sort of, with maybe more experienced media salespeople, is a technique that's being used to kind of good effect to kind of stack the odds in their favor?
I love this question. And you've mentioned, I guess, strategic thinking a couple of times in our discussion today. Over the years, I've learned and had lots of discussions with people in the industry just about the fact that anyone, and certainly salespeople, can be a bit of a strategist. It's about pushing yourself to learn as much as you can about your client and the industry and your products, and being able to kind of read and then be able to take a bit of your own take on what that looks like and how you can apply that to conversations. And I think that kind of strategist mindset is a great way to be able to bring that to life when it comes to like sales depositioning, which would be how we would explain subtly being able to uncover what competitors could be doing and how you can, from your side of things, be able to deposition what they're doing and subtly influence what a solution could look like from your product suite at the same time.
There's this amazing line of thinking around red teaming, and red teaming is really that idea of how would the competitors think. And I know that in previous pitches where we had a really high stakes piece of business, there would actually be a lot of merit in assigning a couple of people in the project team, like the role of being the red team. So you need to respond to this brief almost like as a mock brief and operate like you are from competitor A and you need to be from competitor B. Interpret the brief, imagine that you've got their product suite and their capability, and then come back in and tell us what you would actually pitch in the room. And the amount of times it would reveal a blind spot that we would have, either in going, oh, I would never have even thought of that, but if our competitor were to respond like that, we'd be in pretty bad shape on this. That kind of thing, probably dovetails into my next question, which is like, when time is of the essence and when you can't maybe indulge in those kind of exercises, how do you roll with that? So here's an example, right? Let's say the time frame that we have to pull this entire solution together with all the stuff I said before, creative mocks, a beautiful, really visually high impact deck, a team that are going to go in and present it beautifully, that are rehearsed and are going to hit their marks. Let's say you got 3 to 4 business days, less than ideal. What is your approach when time constraints are communicated from the client or agency? Do you try to negotiate an extension? Does that put you at a disadvantage? How do you socialize that internally with your stakeholders to get people on board with an expedited process? Like, what happens when time constraints are a real issue?
Something that I think many salespeople have to work through on a daily basis. I feel like my position over the years has changed on this. That, you mentioned there, do we ask for a time extension? Traditionally, I would have said, no way. Client always comes first. We're going to work really hard to hit their deadlines. But I certainly don't think it hurts to be able to pick up the phone again and have that conversation around understanding why there's such a tight turnaround in terms of time frame, and whether or not there is the opportunity for being a bit more flexible to be able to respond at the same time without being on the back foot as well. So always ask the question, but I think always be prepared that you might not be able to get that additional time frame there. I think the other thing that businesses have become a lot more savvy with because the market has become a lot shorter, is that we're a lot better now at having, I guess, baseline pitch proposals on hand that we can feed into. We certainly would love every single brief response to be fully tailored and beautiful and have its own sizzle. But there will be these moments where, just there are things out of your control. You can strive for perfection, but perfection certainly is not the be all and end all. You kind of got to go to 80% and sometimes let it go. And it's in those moments having some of those baseline templates and processes on hand that make that process a lot easier. And then I think the final layer is this is where your client relationships come in. It's understanding who you're working with, what they value within this solution building process. Is it the sizzle? Is it the hot rates? Is it the idea? Is it the strategy? And I'd suggest at that point in time, if you're able to identify where they're going to get the most lean in from, you focus probably a bit more on that in terms of being able to highlight that in the room and what the solution looks like. Again, to be able to take your client on the journey and really show them that you're working with them from a partnership perspective.
I feel like I'm almost kind of answering my own question here, but just listening to you sort of answer that and reflecting on it, it's so interesting how sometimes actually time constraints don't necessarily impact the quality of the work. They just get you to arrive at the end outcome quicker. That whole law of how like every task you do just kind of like expands to fill the time you have allocated. I feel like 3 to 4 days really it is probably actually like not going to have a material impact on the quality of thinking compared to if you had 6 to 7 days.
I'd actually agree with that. I think what's really interesting is that you come to learn and understand what, I guess, the typical time period it takes to respond on a brief, how you work with other departments. And then I think from a sales perspective, you're that project manager. So it's really up to you to have that empathy to understand how long it takes for others within that process to work through what their output looks like. And then that final layer is, in sales and in media sales, you're not just wanting to work on one piece of business at a time. You are hustling in the background and hopefully you're working on multiple pieces of business. So where that, I guess, that timeline or that time frame comes into it is actually the juggle between the different responses that you might have on the go, how you pick up one, you run through a brainstorm on that one while you're closing on another one and maybe pitching in the background. So I guess it's understanding what that typical cycle could look like for you and then being able to prioritize when and where you need to pull those levers on what needs to leave the business first and how you work with those teams to best get those results that are going to drive solutions for your clients.
Such a good point, because you're right. Like the mental agility we're probably requiring from a lot of market-facing media salespeople at the moment is just insane. Like they're responsible for the entire end-to-end experience of the customer from initial brief right through to post-campaign. They're probably having to monitor and course-correct campaigns that are live on the fly. They're probably having to delegate out to their sales support, and just working in the day-to-day can actually be quite a big workload to manage. So, with a brief like this, when it comes in, that panic and that overwhelm can kind of set in. And what I'm really interested to hear from you is, sequencing, right? So a lot of sales processes or brief to pitch processes are sort of linear, but they actually need to kind of look more like a Gantt chart. You need to have a lot of plates spinning at the same time. At a kind of more of a macro level, what in your view is kind of the ideal sequence of tackling each step? Like how linear is it versus how much do these steps need to be concurrent to actually make sure that everything gets delivered on the timeline and to the quality you need when, the deadline is tight?
In a perfect world, we're working in media organizations that you are able to have that level of collaboration with other people. So we spoke earlier around setting expectations and understanding who owns what in the workflow process. That is a huge help, because that whole brief to pitch process, there's so many steps and different elements within that would be a lot for one person to take on. So if you're in a position where you do have that level of resource, it's amazing to be able to work together as a team to make sure that you're ticking everything off and understanding how you can work together to get the best result to get out to market and to the client. What I would say though is that under pressure sometimes, it is quite helpful actually just to have that linear workflow in front of you, because it enables you to, I guess, identify where you can cut some corners and bring it back to workflow. So where you might have initial process that needs to have some sort of brief or template filled out, but you're really under time constraints, you might be able to, in this one instance, and as long as it's not a regular or the majority of times that you work in these moments, that might be the instance that you can go, look, am I able to do a verbal brief on this one so that we can move down to 3/4 of the way down that process to speed things up and actually take some impact off both my workload, but also other people's workload at the same time.
Yeah, I want you to hold that thought because I'm going to dive into the listener question.
I can't ask my sales manager that.
Hey Jamie, I'm an agency rep in radio. I feel like whenever I get a big integrated brief response, I'm always waiting for other stakeholders to provide their elements past the initial internal deadlines they set. This always leaves me with minimal time to build out the full deck or practice my presentation. How do you get your internal teams to adhere to the deadlines?
This one doesn't sound like something you and I've encountered at all at any point in our career, Lena. Have you had this come up before?
I guess my first answer would be get comfortable with feeling uncomfortable because this is going to be a bit of your life. And look, I think as the key project owner within that process, I think to really support your own workflow, it's starting to understand to what degree you can pull together the entire process or the entire proposal with those final pieces kind of pending. So you can actually work with other teams to get an understanding of the sentiment that they're going for, the direction that they're kind of taking, so that you can kind of pick up either different proposals or do your own work in the background to get it to like 80 or 90% before you drop in what their solutions and final pieces look like. That said, if you take a step back, it's again all about managing expectations and having a high level of communication. I think at the beginning of any of these projects, you need to be really clear on what deadlines look like and whether or not it's the type of client or if you're in the type of market that you can even go past that deadline, and being able to be, I guess, really clarify up front what the risk or reward would look like in terms of us missing those deadlines. And businesses and people understand that. And then I guess it's just allowing for and having those moments to check in, being empathetic to what else is going on. And then at the same time, being able to foresee if things are going to be delayed, again, pick up the phone and talk to your client. Ask them if we're able to send things a little bit later. I do find that 95% of client requests these days have an element of flexibility. And if there's no flexibility, they're pretty clear up front. Hey, if you don't deliver by this time or date, you're going to miss out. So you have a really good understanding of where that risk kind of lies.
I'd also say for this one, if it's a salesperson waiting on internal stakeholders, 90% of the time, the internal stakeholders will actually request an extension. They won't just miss a deadline. They'll actually sort of say or raise the alarm early and say, hey, listen, I'm going to have to potentially get that to you a bit later. The thing that used to drive me nuts in sales director roles was when you'd have a rep then come and complain when they actually authorized the extension. So it's kind of like, I hate to say it, but it's like, think about what is the minimum amount of time you require to respond to the brief at the level you require. If that's 3 hours, 4 hours, a whole day, whatever it is. And you kind of have to hold your nerve a bit there and go like, this is the time that I need to protect in order to do my component. So unfortunately, this is potentially the latest that I can receive those elements. Make that deadline a couple of hours earlier than the time, so there's a bit of buffer built in. I'm not saying it's easy, but to me, this is always one where the salesperson actually has more control than they realize. It's often just them not properly allocating time for themselves because they are, it's almost as if they're feeling guilty about pushing back or getting an internal department to adhere to a deadline that actually is required.
Yeah, no, I agree with that sentiment for sure. I think there's an interesting element of that which we've had on the day-to-day over the years, which is whether or not you have to pitch in person versus if you're sending it over via email. The amount of times I've been in the car driving to an appointment and you're making those final finesses to that presentation, but lo and behold, every single time you have to present face-to-face, you're always able to pull something together and discuss it in the room, even if it's at a top-line level and it's not in the slides. I find that really interesting. I have in recent years worked with my teams on, I guess, one hot tip that seems very simple, but sometimes we forget about it, is that you can actually pre-write out your response email. You don't need to wait to the last minute to craft that email at the same time as when you're sending over that final solution. So if you've got everything sitting there ready to go, and then you're just able to have those final elements where you can finesse within your proposal and flick that over, you've got the email ready to go. That takes a bit of the pressure off at the same time, because you're essentially able to just make a couple of edits and then flick it over. It's good to go.
Oh, totally agree. I think even in the brainstorm, you can make an argument that you could actually write out the narrative structure of your proposal in the brainstorm when you've got the idea, and then it's a case of being able to build out that base template. Lena, this is kind of the end of episode 1. This is a 2-part series, so I really look forward to having you on the next episode, because we're going to sort of dive into this and unpack it a bit further. But thank you for your time today, and I look forward to having you back on in 2 weeks.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's been great.